Namaste and welcome to Dragonfly Cookery and Knives. This is video number 2 in our 3-part series on what knife to select. And this is where the first video was the anatomy of knives. Now, I explained in that last video why I think sometimes, those of us who are in the cutlery industry, in the knife industry, who have been collecting and using knives for a long time, we sometimes forget about those people who are just being introduced to knives from the first time, and they know nothing about knives. And all of us were there at one point or another at the beginning of our knife hobby, for a lack of a better term. And those of us who have been collecting and using knives for a long time, we talk to each other so much and share information with each other. And granted, if anybody's listening in, they're going to learn a lot. But I haven't seen a whole lot of videos that just deal with the basics. First of all, what is a knife? And let's talk about it. Let's talk about how to talk about a knife. A knife is not just a sharpened piece of steel with a handle on it. That's a very overly simplification of what a knife is. A knife is actually a tool that has a certain design purpose. And, you have kitchen knives, you have chef knives, you have hunting knives, you have fishing knives. So you have knives that have all been designed with a specific purpose. And how they were built is very important when you're thinking about buying a knife and applying that design to a particular function of your intended use. So, with that all being said, I went over Knife Anatomy 101 and broke down all the definitions of a knife, whether it be a fixed blade or a folding knife. And so we learned a lot of new definitions for people who are just coming into the knife collecting or knife ownership. And know pretty much close to nothing. And so hopefully I'm giving you some good, useful information to be able to understand the knife. And when you're talking to a person like myself who sells knives, whether it be at Big 5 Sporting Goods or Walmart, or going to Amazon and reading the descriptions, or going to a knife show or a gun show and seeing knives there, you'll be able to understand some of the conversation that's being shared with you, that's giving descriptions of the knives that are being offered. And in that way, with your good understanding, you'll be able to make a very intelligent decision and good choice that will be a good fit with you. And it won't be a knife that'll sit on your shelf that you look at and never use because you can't stand it, or it doesn't do what it was supposed to do besides just cut an envelope. But it is a knife that you're going to use, whether it be every day or on those special occasions like when you go hunting or fishing or camping. So that's what we talked about in the first video. Now in the second video, we're going to be talking about, in this one, about the steel, the handle materials, and the sheath materials. And we're going to be using terms called form follows function or philosophy of use. Pretty much I'll be using them interchangeably, but they boil down to pretty much the same thing. Philosophy of use is when I designed this tool, it was designed to be used in this particular fashion. Form follows function is how well does that design do that function? Does it really agree with the philosophy of use, the intent and why it was designed? And these are things that we need to come to the table with when we are making that selection of the knife that we're going to purchase and start using. So to start off, let's talk about, we talked a little bit about in the last video about the anatomy of a fixed blade knife versus a folding knife. Folding knives are knives with moving parts. They tend to be a bit smaller than a fixed blade knife. Doesn't always mean that they are bigger. I can give you an example, which I will do right now if I can find it, of a very large folding knife that's bigger than some fixed blade knives. And to give a very good example of a small fixed blade knife, here you have this folding knife in its folded state. It's actually bigger than this fixed blade knife that would fit on your sheath or on your belt. Okay? And yet this is a fixed blade knife. It's also a full tang knife, which we learned about in the last video. This one has moving parts. It is made by cold steel, so it has that very secure, strong locking mechanism. So when it's opened and ready to use, this knife, which is a kukri design, which is meant for chopping, it has a V-grind, which facilitates that on its blade, which helps it be a good chopper, and a slicer. So with this handle, it's a big enough handle, I could actually use a folding knife with both hands, which is very interesting in its design. But it is form follows function. It was designed to be a folding chopper. And with the locking mechanism, this could take a lot of beating and never fail. So it's actually a very useful folding knife. Now, when we talk about knife steels, we talk about a lot of different things. I'm going to introduce some terminology to you, and I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail about these terminologies. What the information that I'm going to be sharing in this video can be researched by Googling it on the internet. Do your search as what are the steels used in knives, okay? And then what will come up in that search engine, it'll be a lot of different useful sources in which you can click on that'll give detailed breakdown of each type of steel. So if you want to know more about a certain type of stainless steel, then you can research on it. If you want a little bit more about high carbon steel, you can search on that. Tool steel, you can search on that. Which brings me to a point. I just used 3 terms of types of steels that are very important. So when you go to make a selection, there's basically 3 types of steels I want you to primarily think about. Stainless steel, high carbon steel, and tool steel. Because all knife makers use either variations of all of these different types of steels, or they might use one in particular. There are certain companies like, for instance, Buck Knives. Majority of their knives are made out of a 420 carbon steel, which is a stainless steel, has a little bit more chromium in it, a little bit more carbon in it than 440 stainless steel. But these are types of stainless steels that will tell you how stainless they are, basically. And the more chromium in it that's in it, the more resistant to stains and rust. Where more carbon in the steel, the more susceptible they are to weather conditions such as wet weather. They will tend to rust on you if you don't take care of them and clean them in water and oil them. So, but there are reasons why you would want a high carbon steel over a stainless steel in particular types of knives for their designed use. So the main steels that I want you to think about is stainless steel, high carbon steel, and tool steel. Now, stainless steel it's kind of in the name. It's resistant to stains and rust. So it's going to be usually a more harder steel. It will be very resistant to the elements. A high carbon steel will be able to be a little bit more flexible. It'll be a strong steel that can take punishment. That would be really great for like a machete or for a large bowie knife or a kukri, which we'll talk about those different types of knives and their designed intended purpose. But they are a knife that would be very suitable for a high carbon steel to be used with. But any of the blades knives that are traditionally stainless steel, or knives that are traditionally high carbon steel, can also be used a different steel, and that different steel would be a tool steel. And some of the common names that you will hear when we're talking about tool steels would be like D2 tool steel, or A2 tool steel, or O1 tool steel. Those are all different types of steels that have certain different types of mineral and like chromium and carbon all blended together that makes it a steel that's harder than other steels. It's a steel that, like for instance, a certain tooled steel will be used for a drill bit that is designed to drill through other metals. So it needs to be very strong and very tough. And a lot of those tool steels will determine also how they should be hardened or heat treated. And so that's another thing that we're going to talk about. The steels are often rated by something that's called a Rockwell rating. Now, a Rockwell rating will refer to the hardness of that steel. Now, there's Rockwell, or HRC, you might see, has a specific meaning, and I didn't write it down, so I can't quote it to you verbatim. But it is, what it really boils down to is the hardness of that cutting edge. How hard of a steel is that? So when somebody is referring to the Rockwell rating and the hardness of the steel, this is one of my designs. It's a camp knife. It is made out of a high carbon steel. It's 5160, which has actually been harvested from the leaf springs of a car, probably a Mercedes-Benz or BMW in India. And they've taken that steel and they've reshaped it into this knife shape, and then they hardened the steel. Now, how did they harden that steel? Well, in Nepal, which is where I had this knife made, they use water. And they'll take this, they'll heat it up to a certain color in the forge, and when it gets to that certain color, they'll take a teapot of water and they'll run it right along the cutting edge. And this creates what we call a differential heat treat. And what that means is that this edge where the water hits is going to become more crystallized, and it's going to be harder. And where the water cooled the steel but didn't really touch yet, which might be in the middle, it doesn't get as hard. And where the water didn't touch at all, it stays soft. It'll get a little bit hard, but not as hard as the cutting edge. And that is a differential heat treat. Now, why would you want to heat treat a steel like this? Well, for a large camp knife like this, that's going to be used for splitting wood and chopping and doing a lot of different types of cuts, I'm wanting that knife to have certain flex with it and be forgiving from the blows that I will put upon this knife. So that edge is going to be at a higher Rockwell rating. It's going to be harder than it will be up at the spine. Now, Rockwell rating, let's say we gauge it from 40s on up to the 60s. 40s being softer, 60s being harder. So if I say that this has a Rockwell rating of 56 on up to 58, that lets you know that it's pretty hard. But it's not as hard as a 60 Rockwell rating, and it's not as soft as a 52 Rockwell rating. So this means that this Rockwell rating, the hardness of this edge, will allow it to be hard enough to cut and chop and slice, but it will, if it rolls, it can be corrected. It'll be easier to sharpen in the field, and it will hold a really good edge. It'll keep an edge for a long period of time because it's probably around the 57, 58 Rockwell rating. Now, another thing that we talk about when we're talking about heat treating is tempering. Now, tempering is where you would take this knife blade after it's been hardened, and you would sit it in an oven, and you would heat it at a very moderate heat, but not hot enough to where it's going to take away the hardening of the steel. It's actually going to kind of help the crystallization to stabilize. Now that will also make this knife, especially if it's differentially heat treated and tempered, it'll allow that knife for me to bend it and then have it spring forward. So it's called a spring tempering, allowing it to flex and bend and yet still come back true. So that is very desirable for especially large knives like machetes, where you go through jungle and you're hitting a lot of different types of material and cutting through materials to make a trail, and you want that blade to be able to flex when it hits a variety of different materials. So now when it comes to heat treating, like I described in Nepal, they use a water pot to go along there. When you're talking about tool steels, like let's say it's a D2 tool steel or O1 tool steel or a A2 tool steel, some of those steels are oil quenched. So they're going to take the edge and dip it into a trough of oil, or like you might see in Forged in Fire, where they have that tube and it's filled with oil, and you see them douse it. They put the entire blade that's all hot red, it's red in color, and they dip it in there and big flames come out, and that's because that oil ignites from the temperature of that steel. So most of those steels are oil quenched, even though they might be a high carbon steel or stainless steel or a tool steel, and even if they're a Damascus steel. Now Damascus is when you're taking a variety of different steels. Maybe you want like a 1095 high carbon steel mixed with a different carbon steel, but a harder carbon steel, and you're going to want certain patterns to appear on the blade. Makes it look very pretty, aesthetically looking, but yet it's also very strong, and it makes a very good and useful knife, especially when you've allowed the carbon layers to be patterned and formed in the right way. In other words, not causing cracks or separations, or having the soft metal at the cutting edge, because then it won't stay sharp. So these are all things that you would think about that you're going to encounter when you're shopping for a knife. So just remember, the tool steels are usually oil quenched, or they might be either taken to very low temperatures, like some of the D2 steels are, and which really fixes that steel to make it very hard and durable, and yet not too brittle for use as a knife. There are certain knife companies that do that, and so the way that it's heat treated is very important into the selection of your knife. Knowing and learning what the Rockwell rates mean, I used to think 60 was the best, that you shouldn't get any knife that's any softer than 60. But then as I became more educated about steels and about the Rockwell ratings and what they mean, sometimes you don't want a 60 Rockwell rating. Now there was a particular knife maker who is no longer with us, unfortunately, and that was Phil Hartsfield, who would take his knives and swords to, on the cutting edge, he would have it in at a 60 to a 63 Rockwell rating, which a lot of people would criticize and say, I don't know how he does it, because those hard edges should be chipping a lot and failing and cracking, but they don't, and he had a way of treating them in such a way that they had that really hard edge, and yet it stayed sharp and was not brittle at all, and they didn't chip or roll. And so he was a metallurgist, and he really knew what he was talking about and what he was doing with that steel. And he usually made all of his knives out of A2 tool steel, which was a tool steel. So that is very, very important, and hopefully I've covered that quite sufficiently, and I'll recap it at the end. Now let's talk about handle materials, because I don't want to spend too much time on that. But like in this particular knife, it has a wood handle. Now this wood handle is Indian rosewood. It's a hard wood, but it hasn't been treated. So if I don't take care of this handle by oiling it and caring for it, it will start to deteriorate just as though it was a stick laying in the woods. It will start to rot. So this is a high maintenance wood when it's untreated. I have to oil it. Now a good way of doing it is soaking it in some ink oil or a type of oil, and it will help keep the life of this handle for a very long time. Now, by saying that, here is 100-year-old cookery with the same type of wood that's on this, and this wood has no fractures, no chips, minor chips on it because it's over 100 years old and it was carried into war. But it's in very, very good condition and still can function, and it's over 100 years old. One might even consider that it might be petrified. Not quite, it has to go through quite a few more years for that. Now, handle materials. This is a wood handle that has been impregnated with or treated with a lot of resins and a lot of epoxies that will stabilize this wood to be impervious to weather conditions and heat. And so this wood is not going to shrink. It's not going to start rotting and decaying. It's going to be resistant to stress fractures and cracks and chipping. So this handle will last a very, very long time in the condition that you see in it. And there won't be any shrinkage where it will separate from the bolster or the butt plate. So very, very good. And yet I still have the enjoyment of, in this case, it's a blue dyed wood with all those beautiful grains that make it very beautiful. And it's very useful and yet highly functional. Then there's other materials like G10 or micarta. Now, G10 is a kind of a resin impregnated type of material. It's a plastic. It's layered, and it is very hard and impervious also to the weather conditions and elements. Now, I don't know the exact chemistry of G10. All that I know is that it can be very slick, but very tough and resilient to weather conditions, and makes a great handle material. And a lot of knife companies use it. Micarta was developed here in the United States, and it is often made with layers of cloth or paper, and it is again impregnated with certain epoxies and resins that make it very, once it stabilizes and it's dry, can be shaped into a handle material and attached to a knife. And what its form and function for is giving a very impervious, strong, sturdy, usable handle that it will retain grippiness when it is wet. You could dip this in oil, and this knife with this handle material is still going to stay in my hand. It's not going to fall out of my hand. It's going to stay tacky and grippy and be very useful. So micarta is an excellent material choice that is great for knives. And it can be in a raw or roughened type of texture that a lot of knife companies like to do, or it could be very slick, like what Bark Rivers does, is they polish it and they sand it, and it's very smooth. However, when this is wet, it's still grippy in the hand. It's not going to slide out of your hand, although when you're holding it in your hand when it's dry, you might think it might be a bit too slick, but it's not. It kind of deceives you a bit. It's very beautiful, very smooth, and yet when it's wet, it's very grippy. So excellent, excellent knife material. Now, there are plastics knife handles that are used. There are rubberized handles. Cold Steel is a company that came up with Kraton, or they actually didn't invent Kraton. Kraton was around, but they were the first one to start using Kraton for knife handle material. And it turned out to be a fantastic material to use for knives. And the reason being, it's got rubberized, so it's kind of soft and spongy, but not too soft and spongy. It has a little give to it. Cold Steel always puts texturing on it, so it'll stay in your hand when dry, But if you were putting this in motor oil, you could still hold onto this knife and it's not going to slide out of your hand at all. You could still use it, whether you have motor oil on it, water, blood, or whatever on your hand, it's going to stay in your hand and it's not going to slide out of your hand. Where if a more plastic style handle, like this particular knife has, that's made by Schabard, it's a very comfortable handle. The ergonomics is good. It's a plastic scale handle, but if this were wet, it would tend to be a little bit more slippier in the hand, and you could actually possibly lose the knife, especially if you got motor oil on it. So this would be one that you would have to think about, that handle material and what you're coming in contact with when you're using that knife. But is it still useful and functional? Yes. And this particular plastic is a very strong and durable plastic, so it's not going to chip or break or fall apart on you. But since we're talking about Schabard, Schabard will oftentimes come out with the same knife design, and they'll use like different handle designs or handle scales. This particular one has a rubberized handle scale that is very similar to Kraton in that when it's wet, it does stay in your hand. It doesn't have the same tackiness that Kraton does, but it is very good and very comfortable and has a little bit of a sponginess, which makes it easier and friendlier to the hand when using the knife. And the way that they have the contours and everything allows it to be very user-friendly. Now, this same knife also is offered in a G10 scale, and the G10 looks like this. Now, the G10 adds weight to this knife. It's almost like having something that's light and feathery and something that's a little heavier and solid. So even though it's the same knife, it has a very solid feel to it. Now, this has that G10 handle, and they put texturing on it to make it very grippy in your hand when it's dry. And even if it's wet, it's going to still be grippy in your hand. It's not going to slide out of your hand very much. Now, this might change the price point of that same knife by a few dollars, but not by much when it comes to Schabard. Now, other knife companies, when you upgrade to a handle material like G10 or micarta, could end up costing you more. So that kind of covers handle materials in a very broad way. Now let's talk about sheath materials. Some of the knives that I've held up and shown, like this one, has a leather scabbard. Now this knife company, which is Bark Rivers, makes this knife, which is made out of an A2 tool steel. Okay, it has a flat grind that goes down to a convex edge. It is a full tang construction with a G10 handle that's brightly colored blue, and it comes in this leather scabbard. This leather scabbard is vegetable oil tanned, and it is double stitched, very high quality, and as you can see, there was a lot of thought. They actually put a little dent in this scabbard to allow for this retention strap to tuck away, so when I go to put this knife away, it doesn't cut the tabs. So now I've described this knife in a very intelligible way, talking about all the materials in which it was created, and also about the handle slabs and about this. So if you were to try to think about purchasing this knife, you would already know a lot about this knife. This leather is oil tanned, vegetable oil tanned. That's very important because I can house this knife in this scabbard and not have to worry about my blade getting corroded and getting rusted. There are some leathers that I have picked up overseas that I put in knives that are urine tanned, meaning they've used pig urine or another animal's urine to tan the leather, to soften that leather, and the acids in that urine actually starts eating away at the blade. It will start rusting that blade. So there are ways to correct that by applying mink oil and getting soaking it in mink oil will kind of neutralize some of those acidities and keeping your knife from rusting. But in this particular case, this is a very high quality leather scabbard that is vegetable tanned, so it doesn't hurt the blade. But if I wanted to waterproof this leather, I would need to treat it with a mink oil. Oil will keep it, mink oil is great for weatherproofing leather and keeping it resistant to the elements. You could go through a river with it and you don't have to worry about the water soaking into the leather and keeping it wet for days. It'll be resistant and repellent. Now that doesn't mean you could take a leather scabbard and go scuba diving with it. Eventually that water will seep in. Then you have Kydex sheaths. Now this particular knife has a Kydex sheath. Kydex is a type of plastic that gets molded to a specific knife. Custom knife makers use Kydex a lot. It's a really great material for holding and housing your knives. If they are made properly and that they have drainage holes, that if you were to take this in the water would drip out of the drainage hole. Now this particular knife, it's made by Blackjack Knives. That was one thing that they forgot to do, and that's put a drainage hole in this. Otherwise, and this is called a pancake shape Kydex scabbard. It's been heat treated to the knife, and there's no retention straps or anything to lock this in other than this bolt right here. It keeps it from falling out. Now I can slide that little bolt down, and now by pushing up with my thumb I can take this knife out of its scabbard and use it, and then put it back and lock in. And even without locking that bolt there, it's still not going to fall out. So Kydex is a great material that a lot of knife makers are using, a lot of production knife makers are using. Here's one that I used or had made for one of my custom knife designs, and this one was made by Neem Tenji in Nepal, and we wanted to implement a Kydex sheath. Same thing with this one. This one was also made by him. This one is the pancake shape with your rivet holes on the side, which allows you different lashing points. It has a D-ring with a piece of leather to attach to your belt, so it's not going to be carried high and poke you in the ribs, but can be hung down lower. And so this one, we're in the new versions, we're going to put a drainage hole. It doesn't have a drainage hole, but it is locked in very tight, very well, because it was heat form fitted to this knife. And so all I have to do is push off and take the knife out, put it back in, and it has great retention. There's no further retention needed. And this one is called a taco style, where they've taken the Kydex and bent it over when they heated it and formed it to this particular knife. So it's actually formed for this knife. And he put a thumb ramp to where it makes it easy to push off and draw out that knife. So Kydex is an excellent material. It's also very impervious to the weather conditions. It handles hot weather, cold weather, wet weather. It's really a great material to use, and a lot of times there's a lot of lashing points that make it compatible to fix to your backpack, your shoulder straps, your belt. There's a variety of different ways to carry it, and there's also lots of different attachments that you could put on this scabbard to make it even more useful, like like a ferro rod carrier, or a pouch to put your tender gear in. The same thing with this type of knife. So Kydex is very, very good. Then you have something that's created by, and it has also been trademarked and patented by Cold Steel, and that's Secure X, which is a plastic material. It's a very hard plastic material, almost like Kevlar, and it is formed for particular knives. Wasn't formed with this knife in it, but it was formed for this particular knife. And it is excellent. And they have a locking mechanism where you just push that knife in there, and it stays, and you can't get it out unless you push off with your thumb, just like the Kydex blade. It actually has a stiffer resistance than some of the Kydex that I've used. This one is MOLLE compatible, and then they have a lot of lashing straps on it. It has, and they use corduroy, a nylon strap for the belt that has a snap and Velcro that allows for it to be put on your belt and taken off your belt very easily. Also, it has a snap, which does not to keep the knife in, but to keep that knife from bouncing against you when you're carrying it on your belt. So there's a lot of thought and good purposes for this particular kind of hard plastic knife. Now, there are other companies that use a type of plastic, but isn't that kind of plastic. Like, for instance, this Moro knife. This Moro knife has a plastic scabbard. It does have a drainage hole in it. It fits the knife very well. This is a Moro. It's a Scandi grind, stainless steel from Switzerland, I believe, or Sweden. And it has Switzerland, I believe. It has a hard plastic insert that has a partial tang. It's not a full tang all the way to the end, and encapsulated with a rubberized grippy handle, and it fits in its scabbard very, very well. And it's very light, and it will attach on your belt really good, or just fit in your backpack, and you won't even notice you have it because it's so light. And a lot of people favor this knife. So again, introducing those type of materials. Now, another type of material that's used a lot by Tops knives, and a lot of other knives companies make them, and this is a Cordura, or what they would also call it like a heavy-duty nylon type of scabbard. Now, their scabbards will have this nylon or Cordura type of belt sheath that is MOLLE compatible, so it has lots of different lashing points. It has an integrated pocket with a nice lock cap. You could fit another little carry knife, like a pocket knife in there, a tender pouch, or tender bag, tender tin with your tendering in there. There's a lot of things you could do. It's very useful and very thoughtful. And it has a plastic insert inside, which allows for that knife to fit in there. Now, this particular one, I believe, no, it isn't. It actually is in the shape of the knife. Now, sometimes the knife company will design it in such a way that allows for different carry method in it, which allows for ambidextrous. In other words, you can be a lefty or a righty, and you can put it in there. Now, this particular one isn't. A lot of Tops knives are rather are made for that particular knife, and are oftentimes specifically made for right-hand carry or left-hand carry. And you can request that from them as to whether you want a left or right, and I'm sure they can accommodate that from their company. If you're buying it at a store or on Amazon, you don't really get that kind of option. But this one has Velcro retaining straps, because this knife will slide out and fall out if you don't use it. So but this is has a lot of uses for this type of scabbard that makes it very good and a good companion with the knife. Now, a lot of people don't really like it a lot. Now, another corduroy type of knife scabbard that is made by Ontario Knives is you have this nylon scabbard with the plastic insert, and I'm not sure, maybe this one is ambidextrous. We'll find out. No, this one is not. And this is a particular style knife. It's a bolo style. That's the shape of the blade. Has a saber grind. It is about a 1/4 inch thick in its spine, that stays pretty consistent all the way up to the grind bevel. It is a full tang in a craton handle, encapsulated. So, giving you a little information here, using the information that I've already provided for you guys. So this one, maybe it is. Maybe I just didn't push it enough. Yes, this particular knife is ambidextrous. So if I was left-handed, I could change the orientation of how I house this knife in the scabbard, which makes it very friendly to a lefty or a righty, which is really thoughtful and very good design. Now, another design element about this is this little retention strap does swivel to left hand or right hand carry. It'll move over for you. So that's also a really good thing. Another thing is it also can be swiveled out of the way from the cutting edge when you're putting in the knife. So there's a lot of thought that went into this corduroy scabbard, and I will have to say, in many ways, I prefer that over this one because it's ambidextrous, because they thought about this strap and where it can move out. Not only that, it's got fairly deep, well, no, it doesn't have any retention, so it really needs that straps to keep it in its scabbard. So both will fail in that. But there's no Velcro. It's a button snap closure. And I do prefer button snaps because they tend to be a little bit better when you're in a sand type of environment. Velcro will collect that sand and it starts losing its use. It's MOLLE compatible in the back, so it has a lot of the same features that this one would have. It doesn't have the outside pockets, and it doesn't have any attachment ability here, just only on the way that you would strap it to your backpack or carry it on your person from your belt. So now there are still other types of materials. Like in Nepal, what they do as a tradition is they'll take some wood and then they stretch leather over it, and you have a leather and wood scabbard. And that makes it a very useful, especially for this particular style of knife. And but when you're using something that's made like this in a certain particular cultural, traditional way, there are some things that you would need to know about. This you could pretty much hold in your hand any way you want and take this knife out. This one you have to think about keeping your hand on the back up here, so that when you slide this knife out or when you put the knife back in, you're not going to cut yourself, because there's only leather and wood here, and that cutting edge can cut right through here, and if you pulled that knife out in a hurry, you could chop off your digits. So this one has a very specific form follows function to it that you really need to know the function of it. Education is very important when it comes to that. Yet you might find something like this that has a traditional wood handle, not wrapped in leather. They've actually wrapped it in something else. This was customized. But you have your parang, which is a machete type, that will fit in a traditional wood scabbard as it would be carried in Indonesia somewhere. So it could be in the Philippines, could be in Thailand, where they use these a lot. Like I said, Polynesia, they use this style of machete a lot, and the wood scabbard is very important. They can make this wood scabbard out in the field if they lost it or broke or cracked or whatever. So that pretty much covers, I think, all of the different scabbards, the handle materials, and the steel that's used. I know that this video was a bit lengthy. I apologize for that. But hopefully it was all useful information that will help educate you in making an informed decision on your next knife purchase. With that, thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for the last and final video in this series, part 3, where we're going to take all this information and we're going to apply it to making knife selections and what knife will suit the best form follows function for you. Stay tuned. Please like and subscribe on my YouTube page, and leave your comments there, or you can also leave comments and questions at my Facebook page at Blue Dragonfly Trading Post. Please visit my website at dragonflycookeryandknives.com, where you can purchase handmade knives from Nepal, some of my designs, their designs, and also some of my friends' designs. Thank you very much for watching. Namaste, God bless, and stay tuned for the next video. See you later. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.